Hi, and welcome to Where Are the Women Brass Players in Academia? My name is Kate Warren, and I'm a freelance horn player and researcher on gender and brass playing. In this lecture, I will present original research done in 2021 on gender parity in music academia. This event is the ever-anticipated follow-up lecture to Female Brass Players Don't Exist, which was presented at regional horn conferences this past spring. If you attended one of those lectures, I'd like to thank you for your continued support of my work and your interest in gender and brass playing. Female Brass Players Don't Exist does form the educational foundation for much of what you will hear in this lecture. So if you haven't seen it, here's the brief recap. Women make up 31% of the orchestra, but only 16% of brass players. In the original lecture, I discussed the breakdowns of gender by instrument and looked at how that changes when we isolate the top 20 American orchestras versus the whole hiring body. Hint, it changes a lot. I spoke about the history of misogyny and gender roles, and how that influences everything from what instrument we are likely to pick in grade school to who you select for your sublist today. I also discussed the actionable steps you can take to fight this and work towards change in the music industry, notably through the use of education, analysis, and action. If you're now intrigued in that presentation, you can find it available to stream for free, both on YouTube and on my website, katewarrenmusic.com. The main difference between the two lectures is that this one only addresses women in academia. But before we can discuss brass academics, I'd like to give you a brief history of women in academia. Women did not gain access to higher education until the 1830s, beginning with co-ed institutions such as Oberlin and all-women universities like Wesleyan College. Treatment of women in these schools was not always equitable, and to be frank, it almost never was. Women students often faced enrollment caps, found themselves barred from taking certain classes, or dismissed for things such as Oberlin Mondays, where women received Mondays off each week in order to do the men's laundry. Colleges that admitted women, such as Wesleyan and Oberlin, were the first places to begin hiring women in higher education. In these institutions, the first instances that we began to see women in teaching roles was in so-called Dean of Women positions. These deanships began as early as the 1890s and were added to help oversee the growing population of students that were women. These deanships, in contrast to how deans function today, oversaw women students, provided them with guidance, and helped them develop areas of learning while staying segregated from the men on campus. However, these deans were also active teachers, scholars, and researchers, and these positions would be regarded as the forefront of academic rigor if they still existed today. It wasn't until 1972, with the passing of Title IX, that women began to receive a more standardized approach to higher education. Title IX prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or educational program that receives federal money. The passing of Title IX opened access to better classes, new majors, and an overall improved education for women. One of the lasting effects of this was that in 1982, the United States graduated its first class of primarily women receiving undergraduate degrees. Today, women make up 57% of the graduating class. As of 2015, 49.1% of college faculty members are women, but only 31% of music faculty members are women. This is despite the fact that women have been earning more bachelor's degrees than men in the performing arts since the 1960s, and more doctorates in the performing arts since the early 2000s. This ratio, however, is consistent with findings from the 1990s that showed an average of 33% of collegiate faculty members as women, and 24% of music faculty members. In other words, there have historically been fewer women faculty in music than in academia as a whole. One possible explanation for why that is comes from Suzanne Cusick's landmark article, Gender, Musicology, and Feminism, in which she reflects on an incident where Charles Seeger quite literally excluded women, including his fiancée Ruth Crawford Seeger, from an academic meeting about musicology in which he had previously invited them to. Cusick writes, being perceived as women's work would threaten musicology's legitimacy and equality with the great studies of the day, because it would automatically relegate musicology to a position in the intellectual world analogous to the position of women in the real world, a position of inferiority and relative powerlessness. In this article, Cusick explores the idea that women continue to be unwelcome in musical academia as a residual effect of men trying to legitimize music as an academic field through the exclusion of women. The parallel can also be made that women continue to be excluded from performative areas as a byproduct of men trying to legitimize musical performance through the use of masculinity. The same 1993 study, this one, found that only 7.8% of brass faculty members were women. This study utilized data from the Directory of Music Faculties, which has been collecting information on music education in America for over 53 years. And it was comprehensive of all collegiate-level brass teachers in America at accredited 2- and 4-year institutions. Now, to reiterate, this is not a sampled data set. This is in fact taken from the total teaching body of that year, meaning that in 1993, exactly 92.2% of brass faculty were men. My replication of this study, using the same database with 2020 statistics, showed that currently 14% of brass faculty at accredited institutions are women. To contrast, this means that in the 90s, 92% of brass faculty members were men, and today that number is still as high as 86%. Currently, 86% of brass faculty members are men. So where are these women? That's the question I set out to answer with my research study that was conducted in the spring of 2021, this spring. I sampled 84 brass professors that are women, hailing from 79 American institutions. Considering that the National Association of Schools of Music indicates there are 475 women in applied brass positions in the US, the sample size of my research study was 17% of the entire population of women brass academics. However, this study was only made directly available to 122 women, meaning there was an overwhelming response rate of 69%, indicating a high interest and need for this type of research. On average, participants were largely in their 30s, with the second largest population being between the ages of 40 and 45. The majority of participants were horn players, with the second largest group being trumpet players. Interestingly enough, these findings are analogous to a study done in 2020 by Cutts et al. That surveyed gender breakdowns of brass players in American orchestras, which you can now see in purple on the chart. As you can see, the overall statistics for orchestras are lower, but the distribution is fairly similar, representing an overwhelming majority of high brass players, primarily coming from the French horn family. The discrepancy here is that more tuba and euphonium players are represented in academia. However, that is to be expected, as there are likely more positions teaching tuba and euphonium than playing tuba and euphonium while only looking at orchestral positions. Sorry, Dan Folk. The majority of respondents also indicated that they were in non-tenure track or part-time positions, a finding that is consistent with national averages for women in academia. Throughout the study, participants were asked questions about their current employment in academia, any past positions they had held, and their educational experience as students themselves. From the responses, I found that 61% are the only woman to teach a brass instrument at their institution, and 57.3% are the first woman to teach their instrument at that institution. 35.7% of respondents indicated they are the first woman to teach any brass instrument at their institution. That's more than 1/3 of the women I surveyed, are the first ones to have ever taught any brass instrument at their institution. Of the 54 women who taught at the collegiate level prior to their current position, 74.5% indicated that they were the only woman to teach applied brass while they were at the previous institution, while that number increased to 86.7% for women who had held 2 prior positions. It's important to note that of this dataset, 0 subjects indicated that they had previously worked with more than one brass colleague that was a woman. These positions were held on average 10 to 14 years ago, respectively. So luckily, this means that since 2006, the ratio of women to men has been increasing quite rapidly, something that we would expect considering that women are now earning more doctorates in the performing arts than men. Despite reporting not working with other women brass players, 94% of respondents indicated that there were women teaching applied woodwinds at their institution, averaging 3.5 women per school. While it's uncommon for women brass players to have other women brass colleagues, it is likely that there are other women in their department, usually within the woodwind family. As you can see on this scatter chart, it is also likely that there is a small correlation between institutions with more women woodwind faculty and having a higher number of women on the brass faculty. One could extrapolate that institutions that are more likely to hire women are more likely to hire us across the board, rather than just in positions typically held by women. Lastly, and in my opinion, some of the most interesting data that was collected, I looked at these applied professors' experiences with their own applied professors in university. Of the 84 women sampled, 4 held only a bachelor's degree, 80 held master's degrees, and 55 held a tertiary degree of some kind, including both doctorates, second master's degrees, or any kind of diploma. Despite this broad range of higher education, the vast majority of women reported studying with a man throughout their respective degree programs. While these women are largely trailblazers in academia, it's evident that they themselves had very few role models to look up to during their own studies. In conclusion, it's clear that women in brass are an underwhelming minority, both in the orchestra and in the academy. Most women teaching at colleges, universities, and conservatories are the only woman teaching brass at their institution, and many are the first to have ever done so. The women faculty members we currently see are largely the first generation of women to widely teach brass, many of which did not have the privilege of learning from a teacher that was a woman either. Though women academics are becoming less of a rarity, there is still a significant amount of ground to be covered before we see true gender equality in music, and especially in the brass field. I'm Kate Warren, and thank you so much for coming to my lecture today. If you'd like to support, reconnect, or talk to me, feel free to reach out at Kate Warren Music on all your social media, katewarrenmusic@gmail.com, or www.katewarrenmusic.com.